All right, welcome to the Bitcoin Beat with Shaun and Jeff. I'm Shaun. This is my co-host Jeffrey Tiefenthaler. We have a special edition episode today. We're really excited to cover this topic. Jeff, are you ready to get today kicked off?
Yeah, definitely. We got a massive guest here with us today, and we're honored to have him.
All right. Well, me too. I'm excited. We didn't cover really any of these details yesterday because we wanted to get into the weeds today on it. So let's go ahead and bring our guest on today. Mr. Dennis Porter, thanks for joining the show. We appreciate taking time to chat with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Jeff, Shaun, thanks for having me on. Glad to be here and excited to talk about two of my favorite subjects, Bitcoin and the policy space.
Well, that sounds good. You know, for our viewers, as opposed to like a normal run-of-the-mill, who are you, what do you do? Tell us, what is Dennis Porter's reason for being in Bitcoin?
Well, I mean, that's a sort of big question for sure. But the main reason why I fell in love with Bitcoin originally was a friend told me about it in 2017. Never heard the word before in my life. Unfortunately, wish I would have found it a little bit sooner than that. But when I found Bitcoin, I started studying it, started researching it, and immediately fell in love with the technology, immediately fell in love with the ability for Bitcoin to be a tool for cross-border payments, for a tool for financial inclusion. I really saw that it could solve some of the biggest problems that we have in our financial system today. Since then, though, it's been, eight years since I found Bitcoin. And now I've come to appreciate so much more about it, including the ability for Bitcoin mining to balance the grid, mitigate methane emissions, and to be able to help solve some of our greatest energy problems around wind and solar. There's so much to love about Bitcoin, and I can continue to expand my appreciation for it every single day. But today I'm the CEO and co-founder of Satoshi Action Fund, which is a nonprofit that focuses on advancing and hopefully passing into law legislation that is proactive and it's good for the users, and it's also good for Bitcoin, and it's good for the technology for the country. We've had a ton of success doing that. We've been able to pass 12 of our model policies into law across 11 different states, everywhere from the state of New Hampshire to the state of California. We've also done a huge amount of work to get those things to pass. So beyond just writing model policy, we also show up to testify. We help identify who a bill sponsor would be. We help advocates write grassroots letters. We've had over 250,000 letters sent through our systems. We also do academic work, which is something that's a little bit of a feather in my cap as someone who never finished high school and only did one trimester of college. To be able to have my name on a paper, an academic paper that was accepted into a peer-reviewed journal, was certainly a thrill. We've gone on to do 15 of those papers, 7 of them have been accepted to peer-reviewed journals. So we do a ton of work, not only just to come up with the ideas, to draft the language, to get it introduced, to work it through the process, but also to build that intellectual firepower that's needed to help convince lawmakers that these are in fact good ideas. Because you might find your champion, your Senator Lummis of the world, Representative Ammon in New Hampshire, Assemblyman Valencia in California, who love Bitcoin, who really want to work on Bitcoin policy. But to go from one lawmaker who really wants to introduce a great bill to getting 51% of a legislature to vote in favor, you have to really come up with, I think, a lot of compelling reasons for why they should enact that policy. So, but since then, I was just chatting with you both, that I moved to DC recently in November. A lot of our work at the state level has helped us to be able to also have an impact at the federal level. And, I'll pause there, but happy to get into more of that. I think that's going to be the big subject of today, is talking about the Mind in America Act.
Yeah, that's definitely something we're excited about. Jeff?
Oh, well, yeah, I was just going to say before we let you go cook on that, and we want to hear more about it, I will say me and Shaun kind of got into Bitcoin around the similar time as you did. And the way that I look at it is, had I gotten in earlier, I probably would have looked at it as just another traditional financial asset and sold it after it went up and not thought twice, and maybe would have had like some sort of bias to get back in. But as we all know, once you get in and you understand what you actually hold and what you own, you don't really want to sell it. So in hindsight, I'm glad I got in when I did instead of earlier, because I probably would have just sold it and regretted not getting in later.
I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I commonly think the same thing. I would have lost my keys because I wouldn't have had the knowledge or experience to know what I'm doing. Luckily, in 2017, 2018, you have all of these resources, these educational materials, lots of people already online talking about how to custody your Bitcoin. Additionally, like same as you, I might have watched it go up 100 or 500% and sold really early because I wouldn't have understood the technology or understood its capacity or potential. So I, even though I regret that I didn't find it earlier, sometimes I think maybe it was a blessing in disguise.
Indeed.
Yeah, I think we can both agree with that. That's something I hear from people in our local Bitcoin meetup group. There's a few that have been around as long as us, and some that have been a little bit sooner ended up selling as soon as like, oh my God, it hit $10. I'm a genius. I'm going to sell, or it's 100 and I 10x to my $10 investment, and then they're out. So yeah, it's definitely something I think we got in on a sweet spot. You had, Dennis, offered to come on to our podcast, in fact, any podcast, to discuss that Mind in America bill. And for Bitcoiners who like haven't dug into the details yet, we want to get into exactly what that federal bill does. But first, I wanted to ask you about Arizona, because I know you've had some history working in Arizona, not just this year with some bills, but also last year. One had gotten passed. And I have kind of a two-part question, but I wanted to ask you. So Governor Hobbs last year vetoed two Senate bills. It was the 1025 and the 1373. And when she did that last year, she cited that common narrative of it's just too volatile, something that we hear so often. But in the year since she vetoed it, Bitcoin's been less volatile than a lot of things like gold, silver, and even some of the Mag 7 stocks. So what risk do we, like here in Arizona, what risk do we have that her or her staff still haven't educated themselves on Bitcoin and will veto the current bills? I think there's a couple like 1042 and 1649 again that we're assuming likely would get both sides of the Senate and the House to pass them. So what kind of risks do you think we have there?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, last year was an exciting year, in fact, in Arizona. There were the two that were vetoed, but there was a bill that was signed into law that was introduced by Representative Weniger, who has since gone on to run for mayor. Great lawmaker there in the state. Came up with a really innovative idea for how to get some legislation across the finish line. That was HB 2749. That bill deals predominantly with unclaimed property, which is sort of a relatively boring area of policy. When you leave your property or your assets on a crypto exchange, or you leave them on a stock brokerage exchange, or really you have any type of abandoned property where you haven't touched it, you haven't accessed it, it appears that it's been completely abandoned, where the company has reached out, tried to say, hey, we have this property of yours and you don't seem to be in possession of it or able to control it. So if you don't reach out to us soon enough, we will have to end up escheating it to the state. The state ends up holding on to it in perpetuity until the individual comes to reclaim it. It's sort of a mechanism to reconnect people with their property. This is called unclaimed property law. It is in existence in almost every single state in one form or another. And the unfortunate part, though, is because Bitcoin and really all digital assets, because they're a new type of property, there wasn't a lot of rules or regulations written around how the state would manage it. When it was, for instance, if you have your Bitcoin on a Coinbase account and you leave it there dormant for 3+ years and you don't log in, you don't touch it, you don't transact, you don't send new Bitcoin to the account, Coinbase reaches out to you, sends you a letter and says, hey, we notice you seem to not have access to your account. Please respond to us or we're going to have to escheat those assets to the state. Well, when that process happened, what's been happening all across the country oftentimes is the exchange, in coordination with the state, will liquidate it into cash. And then the state holds on to that cash on behalf of the consumer. Well, for all of us that love to hold on to our Bitcoin for the long term, that could be a problem. You wake up 5 years from now, 6 years from now, 7 years from now, and you realize that your Bitcoin that you had on this exchange, you totally forgot about. You go find it. You're excited to find it, but then when you find it, you realize, years ago it was converted into dollars. I mean, the upside that you could lose. I mean, the hardest part about Bitcoin is waiting, right? Is just waiting and waiting and waiting. And imagine you accidentally forget about your Bitcoin and you accidentally wait all these years, and then you go find it and it's no longer Bitcoin anymore. So what happened in HB 2749, there's two parts that were really, really interesting. First, what the bill does when it was passed into law was it said that the exchange, when it was escheating the asset to the state, had to keep it in its native form for a certain period of time. So instead of sending them dollars, they were sending Bitcoin for the state to hold on to on behalf of the consumer. Now, they did this for all crypto, every type of crypto asset. So, it's tech neutral. And the second part of the component of that legislation that's really, really interesting was if there was some type of asset, whether it's an Ethereum or Solana, you name it, there's a million of these tokens that do proof of stake. which means that you can lock up your asset into the network. You can generate additional assets. So think of it similar to like a bank account. You put your dollars in a bank account, in a high yield savings account, and you get more dollars. Well, in this case, if you block up your Ethereum, you get more Ethereum. Well, what the bill did that was really fascinating was it said, okay, well, we're going to do that. We're going to lock up these assets and we're going to generate revenue with them, but we're going to use that revenue to buy Bitcoin for the state. So that's a bill that passed into law. So in effect, it was like I don't know if you would call it a backdoor Bitcoin reserve, but that's how we viewed it. And that policy has since gone on to be introduced in many other states. And we're actually working on it in one of the largest states this year. And we think it has a very good chances of something like that passing into law. And the reason why Governor Katie Hobbs, who might have been concerned about the volatility of Bitcoin, why she signed this bill into law and not the others, because it didn't use public funds. Like this is the big disconnect for a lot of lawmakers is, they're incredibly risk averse. Like almost every lawmaker is very risk averse. Not all of them, but almost all of them. Especially as a collective body too. You might find, you got Wendy Rogers and Fincham there in the state who they're like doing every Bitcoin bill that they can think of. Mm-hmm. But to get the entire legislature on board is difficult. That's collectively they can be very conservative around new ideas, new concepts. But because the HB 2749 bill didn't use taxpayer funds to be able to purchase Bitcoin, that was a much more reasonable and easier to digest approach to allocating into the asset. So despite she vetoed the other ones that Wendy Rogers and Fincham had that were strict, like let's use taxpayer funds to buy Bitcoin. She got rid of those, but she kept this one in place. And I imagine she'll probably, they're trying those bills again this year, Rogers and Fincham, and I imagine that she'll probably veto them again for the same concerns, but it should still be taken into consideration that there is a way for the state to buy Bitcoin today that has passed into law and was signed into law by Governor Katie Hobbs.
Yeah, I want to ask you a little bit about, you mentioned the California recent news again about the achievement process, but first about that Katie Hobbs. And I agree with you. It seems like something that I don't think her opinion would change this year, but what would one key message be for our Bitcoin Beat viewers, especially here in Arizona, but really any state? What can they take away on how to try to help overcome these kind of governor vetoes that can happen even when both sides of the aisle want to push this through on behalf of their constituents?
I mean, the biggest thing is always, engaging in education. I think also that people need to realize that when you're engaging, it's incredibly important to be professional. It's incredibly important to be, just try your best, despite maybe some frustrations, to go in and, keep a calm approach. Getting frustrated visibly or in front of these lawmakers, unfortunately, just always tends to have a negative impact on the policy process. I think a lot of people, because of what they see online and they see how the political discourse is taking place, like they think it's better to just like hammer them over the head and use that as a way to get what you want. And oftentimes it ends up being incredibly counterproductive. So even though it can take time, and sometimes it may take a new person coming in, to represent you. And that's generally the way that I encourage people to voice their frustrations. If you're upset with what your lawmaker is doing, you go to the ballot box. That's the best place to help change the discourse. But if you're talking about strictly on how to educate, I think it's really important to get very good at talking about why a state would want to hold on to Bitcoin, because that's what they're going to ask you. They're going to, if you go in there and you're saying, hey, I think this state should hold on to Bitcoin, the next question is going to be why. This thing seems very speculative. And then of course there's endless amounts of educational resources that people can use. But typically for folks that are in government, things that tend to work really well is that, this is a counterbalance to inflation. States that are holding on to dollars are losing their purchasing power. And if they lose their purchasing power over time, they have two options. Either they got to raise taxes or they got to cut programs. I mean, and neither of those things are good for residents of that state. And so by allocating a small percentage into Bitcoin, states can combat that type of inflation. And they don't even have to buy a lot of Bitcoin. We did a paper recently which outlined that even just a small 3%, and for some states it's less, but on average it's about 3%. If the state were to put about 3% of its funds into Bitcoin, they could combat 100% of the loss of purchasing power. And over the last decade or so, roughly, we've had about a 25% loss. Actually, I think it's even shorter. I think it's like 7 years. The last 7 years, we've had a 25% loss of purchasing power. So every dollar is now worth 75 cents in purchasing power. But if you bought a 3% of Bitcoin, you combated 100% of that. So you keep that purchasing power in place. That tends to be a pretty compelling message to lawmakers. It's reasonable. You're not coming in and asking for something huge. You're helping them understand what the value is to them and their constituents, and not just as something about like, Bitcoin being, gold 2.0, which that certainly will work with some lawmakers, but it's more of these like foundational arguments that I believe are very effective when you're trying to convince lawmakers to understand the value of holding on to something like Bitcoin.
I appreciate those points. Yeah, and Jeff, before I turn over to you, I wanted to just mention, Dennis, when you had mentioned this, specifically the California one about the entitlement laws, the escheatment process. I remember last year that was really big fun, a lot of news going around X and whatnot, and you had a post where you had covered that, I think, just a few days ago again, talking about that. And I have a little bit of experience with that myself, and I mentioned this at our local Bitcoin meetup for people when we were going through it. But for viewers that haven't been able to come to one of those, one of the things I mentioned is I have a history of working in like the insurance field, doing like auto injury claims, litigation, lawsuits, contract type stuff. And every once in a while we'd make a payment where somebody who we owe money to wouldn't actually cash that check. Well, it's not our money. I say our money, the company's money. And so we couldn't just keep it. We had to go through the sheet process, which is basically handing it on over to the state. But I got to tell you, man, it was a bear of a process as an adjuster, as an employee, having to go through steps, because we had to try everything. We had to mail people, we had to call people, we had to email them, we had to send certified letters. We even hired people to go door knock to see if these people were still alive before we could say, hey, government, we tried everything we could and hand it on over. And really, that California law was just basically that. If you can't be reached, they can't keep the money, they got to give it to the state. So I really appreciate the way you explained it right now, and then your post when it covered that. It's definitely not something to be concerned about. It's actually a positive thing. The way that, like you said, the billing is worded so that way it doesn't necessarily always have to be sold.
Yeah, and I'm glad to know that you have some experience with unclaimed property law. Sorry that you have to go through the process of managing it. And certainly different states have different approaches. Some, they require physical mail. Some require more outreach. Some have less. It's really state by state, all types of different models. But what we want to try to do is have a unified model around how digital assets are treated, how Bitcoin is treated, because it is incredibly bad for the consumer if you're liquidating Bitcoin into cash. And some states also do this with stocks too. So they keep the stock for a certain period of time. I believe California is one of those states where they have to keep it in its original form for about 18 to 22 months. So we want to see that unified across all the states with the way the digital assets are treated. And yeah, there's a lot of, I don't know what it is, man. Ever since I got into this space, people just love the dog on California. They love any chance they can get to say something bad about California. But at the end of the day, that bill was worked on quite a bit, originally by Assemblyman Valencia, who's very pro digital asset, very pro Bitcoin. And it was originally AB 1052, and then it became SB 822 as the controller got involved in the conversation, and they worked through another Senate office. But at the end of the day, it's good. Like, it's a good thing. The state is not seizing your assets. It's unclaimed property law that's in place all across the space to make sure that people who have lost the ability to access their property can gain access to it again.
Hey, Dennis, this next question, I know there's a lot of nuance here, and I'm not trying to paint you into a corner, but if you had to choose, does Bitcoin need politicians, or do politicians need Bitcoin?
I get questions like this all the time, so not feeling like I'd be painted into a corner. So what I tell people is, because I hear this, especially when I first got started. I had the podcast media background. When I first started to do something in the Bitcoin space, so to speak, I was running my show, doing Twitter Spaces, a lot of media engagement, and then eventually I started to notice that there were some big political fights coming and brewing around the corner. And I just started telling people on my show, like, we got to be more engaged. We got to educate. We got to work with lawmakers to help them come up with better concepts for policy. And everybody thought I was crazy. They're like, no, we don't need government. We don't even, this is separation of money and state. We want to be able to be separate from government. And I can appreciate those sentiments. I think myself and even many of those lawmakers that you wouldn't think would say this, but many of them do. They say a lot of them have a libertarian streak. I think everybody sort of appreciates personal freedom and responsibility, and that we don't need the government watching over every aspect of our life. But at the same time, like, there is, the world that we live in, there is a government that tends to err on the side of weighing in more often than it doesn't. And so if you want your country to be in a good place, you want to see your ability to self-custody Bitcoin, you want to see the ability to run a node, to be able to transact peer-to-peer. If you want those, what I would say are Bitcoin rights, if you want those rights protected, you're going to have to engage those lawmakers and convince them and give a compelling reason why they should protect the ability for users to access the technology. And we also oftenly say, you might not be interested in government, you might not be interested in politics, but government and politics are certainly interested in you, and they're going to write rules and regulations regardless of whether or not you engage. And so my pitch to most people is that it's really your responsibility and your duty, if you care about the issue enough, to go engage politically and help to drive good and intelligent and smart and effective outcomes for the issues that you care about, whether they be Bitcoin or any other issue.
That's a great answer. I love that, Dennis. And Shaun and I, as active Bitcoiners here in Arizona, we've actually had the opportunity to connect with certain legislators, and I've even been invited to a state senator's home for breakfast burritos to talk with them about friendly Bitcoin legislation. So if there's anything that we can do to help the Satoshi Action Fund make connections here in our state, we want to be a state that pioneers this space. I'm a little biased. I think that we're the best state in the U.S. in terms of progressive legislation for Bitcoin rights. But where would you put Arizona on a scale across all other individual states? I know a lot of other states are doing things as well, but where does Arizona rank?
I mean, you're certainly up there in the runnings for the more progressive when it comes to doing smart policy on Bitcoin and digital assets. There's a lot of other great states too, and that's the thing I love about doing state work and helping to drive policy forward is you get a little bit of this like competition between states, and so plenty of great states out there. Obviously, Texas has done a lot. Wyoming has done a ton of work. We've seen a lot of great work out of New Hampshire. Arizona's up there. Utah's up there. California is making strides over the last couple of years. There's going to be a couple more bills that come out of California that, fingers crossed, if those pass into law, I think would definitely put it near the top of the totem pole. So there's this constant negotiation, there's this constant competition going on between the states. And we're excited to see that Arizona has certainly made its mark in the space so far.
Appreciate the nice words about Arizona. I guess I'd like to take that moment to kind of pivot and tell us about this newest and most important, at least current piece of legislation, the Mind in America bill. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this legislation. This is really a culmination. The ideas and the concepts in here are a culmination of many years of work by myself and many other advocates in the space that have been saying for years, Bitcoin mining is an incredibly powerful tool for balancing the grid, for mitigating methane emissions, for enhancing wind and solar, for building out electrical infrastructure. And we need to start recognizing that and driving policy towards a way that unlocks those opportunities and benefits that come from that technology. But unfortunately, there is one really big problem with the Bitcoin mining space. Despite the fact that we have roughly 38% of the hash rate or the total Bitcoin mining in the whole world, we have 38% of it here in the United States. Despite that is being undermined by a weak foundation built on hardware that is almost exclusively coming from China. And the reason why Chinese products being used for Bitcoin mining is a problem is because these Bitcoin mining machines, the mining operations, are plugged into upwards of 10 to 15 gigawatts of power across this country. And to put that into context, 1 gigawatt is enough to heat 1 million small homes. 15, you sort of multiply, it's easy number to multiply. Luckily, I found a good comparison that makes the math easy. But 10 gigawatts is 10 million small homes. 15 gigawatts is 15 million small homes. It's a huge amount of power. And also because of the ability for Bitcoin mining to be turned on and off very quickly, it can cause potentially, if timed well, significant damage to the grid. Now, the interesting part is the ability for Bitcoin mining to wind up and down quickly is it has its upsides and its downsides. It provides benefits and it also introduces risk. The benefit is that if you need to balance the grid, you can easily call on the Bitcoin miner to wind down and make the power available when there is a lack of available supply. This is very common, in fact, happens quite often in Texas. And there are, very particular cases like in winter storms or in summer heat waves where Bitcoin mining has performed spectacularly in helping to improve the balance of the grid, the reliability of the grid. And that is massive. That you really can't put a price on, saving grid infrastructure and saving lives. So there were two big winter storms, Winter Storm Elliott, Winter Storm Uri. These are important storms to keep in mind. Winter Storm Uri comes through, I think it was like 2022 or 2021, and it pummels the grid. It's like polar vortex, massive storm, billions of dollars of damages occur. Over 700 people died, at least 700 people died. And after that, there was, heads rolling at ERCOT, which is the people that manage the grid there. A lot of people got fired, a lot of turnover, big mistakes being made. So a lot of people were pushed out. And a new CEO came in. His name is Brad Jones, or was Brad Jones. Unfortunately, he passed away just a couple of years ago. Brad Jones comes in and he starts to think more innovatively. He starts to think about other ways that we can balance the grid. And fortunately, at the time, China just banned Bitcoin mining. So all these Bitcoin miners are fleeing China and they're coming to Texas and saying, hey, we need a place to plug in. They did a great job of plugging in, and they also did a great job of signing up for a lot of the grid balancing programs that exist within ERCOT, which is the entire state of Texas's grid. And even so much so that ERCOT put out a winter resource report, which is just to say, like, hey, these are the different assets, resources, tools that we have at our dispense when and where we need them. So they put that out maybe 6 months after the Bitcoin miners move in. And then a very short period of time later, the very next winter big storm that came through Texas, Winter Storm Elliott, almost the exact same situation as the last winter storm. But this time there were additional tools on the grid, including Bitcoin mining. And during that storm, Bitcoin miners wound down and delivered up to 1,700 megawatts of power back to the grid. That's 1.7 gigawatts. That's enough to heat 1.7 million small homes. And as you can imagine, that played a significant role in the positive outcome, I would say, compared to the Winter Storm Uri. Nobody died. There was very minimal damage on the grid because you have these additional resources. So the ability for Bitcoin mining to turn on and off quickly, huge benefit to the ERCOT grid. But in the hands of a malicious actor, in the hands of a foreign adversary, through the firmware and software on these devices, you could decide to turn that energy up or down at the wrong time and cause very significant instability on the grid around critical infrastructure. And that's just an untenable problem that we need to eliminate. So what Mind in America does is it says, okay, we have this national security problem where China has this backdoor into our grid potentially. I think, of course, you have people, security researchers analyzing these machines all the time to make sure there are no backdoors. But in the age of AI and the speed of compute, the speed of being able to deploy a cyber attack is beyond what we've ever experienced before. So if you do this good thing of getting rid of your Chinese hardware and instead buying US-made hardware or Allied-made hardware, you will be able to become a certified Bitcoin miner through commerce. And once you are a certified Bitcoin miner, you get direct access to apply for certain types of DOE and USDA programs, Department of Energy and US Agriculture. And these programs do things like give you the ability for access to loan guarantees. And this is one of the most persistent problems in the Bitcoin mining space is it's very difficult to get a loan for Bitcoin mining that is affordable. You end up getting, they end up being double, sometimes triple the average loan rate. And so what this program does is it says, okay, the federal government will be a backstop on your operations, and we're not going to pay for the loan. You still go out to the private market, you still go out and procure the loan the normal way you would. But what we do is become a backstop for you. So that way you can get a much, much, much more competitive rate. Typically, you get some of the most competitive rates within the marketplace. And this allows for more Bitcoin mining to be built. That's just one example of what the bill does to help drive more demand for US-made hardware, which ultimately will mean there will be more US manufacturing, which means more blue-collar jobs, typically in rural parts of the country. So we're eliminating the supply chain risk, we're eliminating the national security risk, building more onshore manufacturing of Bitcoin mining, and deploying more mining in advantageous ways. Because these programs, they don't just say, okay, here's some money, go do as you please. You actually have to engage in positive behavior. But because Bitcoin mining is so good at engaging in positive behavior, like balancing the grid, mitigating methane emissions, and supporting clean energy, it's very easy for them to access and compete for these federal programs. So there are some other parts to the legislation as well that get into the Bitcoin reserve component, but happy to pause there for now and talk about the main provisions of the legislation.
I'm glad you started with those 2 points. When you talk about, excuse me, the grid balancing, I remember that specifically, and I think it was at the Bitcoin 23 conference. I remember the CEO of Riot talk about that a little bit and how they're able to get power that's stranded when it's not being used cheap. That helps the power companies. Yep. And when they need the power for people, and when it's a heat wave or a severe unexpected winter storm, they can turn off the miners, but they also pay those companies to keep their miners off. So they also save money, but the miners are making money. It just seemed like a perfect harmony that worked out really well. Interesting angle to talk about, tying that into the hardware risk on how 97% of it is from we'll call it an adversary of ours, at least in the terms of technology, energy, and world domination, or world power, I should say. So that's definitely interesting. One thing that I'm wondering, I haven't, and correct me if I'm wrong, I haven't seen a lot of the major miners comment on the bill yet. I know it's a recent bill, but I haven't seen them take a position of supporting it. And I may have missed it, but I would assume we'd anticipate hopefully some of them supporting it, but like say the American Bitcoin company, the Eric and Don Jr. Company, I would assume even if they haven't taken a position on it, they'd probably be supportive of that. Would we expect some kind of support from those type of miners?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for the most part, anybody that cares about this country and they care about our national security and they want to see the energy systems and the environmental systems here in the United States be improved, like they're going to like this legislation. Also, on top of that, of course, is our, domestic competitiveness, or I would say international competitiveness. Additionally, the jobs that would be created by the manufacturing. Of course, we talk to a lot of Bitcoin miners, and everybody, for the most part, that we've been talking to has been feeling very optimistic about the legislation. But I think the important thing to keep in mind here is that what's really going to drive this legislation is not the Bitcoin miners coming out. In essence, matters, right? We want to see them support good legislation. But what's going to drive this is that the fact that it deals with a national security problem and a supply chain problem. I mean, that is, when you go talk to these senators that work in Washington, D.C., which is where the bill is at in the Senate, we're talking to a lot of folks there. That's the thing that really gets them interested in this legislation. And it's even getting people who don't necessarily care. This is the big part. People that don't even really care about Bitcoin or digital assets are interested in this legislation because it solves a critical flaw within our energy systems. And that the China problem, I will tell you, it's probably not something that people wake up every day and think about, the average American, but members of Congress, particularly those that have access to classified information or might be on armed services or other types of committees where they're thinking about our stance in the regional environment or the global environment, they care a lot about what's going on in China, and they care a lot about whether or not China has any type of backdoor kill switch access to anything that's important, including critical infrastructure. And this is really a very bipartisan concern. We've seen multiple pieces of legislation passed. We've seen multiple significant political efforts to uproot any type of access by Chinese hardware within our telecommunication system. There was the Huawei, what they call the rip and replace. This bill sort of touches on a lot of the principles that were built in the Huawei rip and replace. And for those who are not familiar, there was a period of time where all of our 5G cell towers were being built and deployed by Chinese companies. Well, a lot of people thought that's not acceptable. We need to get rid of these Huawei towers and replace them with American or allied-made hardware. They called the program Rip and Replace, and it was very successful. Same thing with the CHIPS Act. We want to see more chips being fabricated here in the United States. That passed into law with wide bipartisan support. And now we are starting to see the development and the build-out of chip factories, chip fabs here in the U.S. Some of them are actually in Arizona. I think I drove by one maybe like a year ago or so that was being built there. So this is not something where we need, everyone to come out of the woodwork to support it, because it has such a critical importance to our national security. And for those senators that care, and there's many of them that do, that's going to be enough to get them involved, let alone all the opportunities with the energy side, the environmental side, the job side, and the fact that we're onshoring a totally new form of hardware or infrastructure.
Yeah, it's great, Dennis. Really, at a high level, this bill goes deeper than simply owning Bitcoin. In fact, the risk isn't around the Bitcoin protocol or the Bitcoin core consensus layer. Those rules won't change. The risk is more at a national security level. And can you talk a little bit more about that distinction? I know you've mentioned people like Major Jason P. Lowry, who wrote the book
Mhm.
Soft War. I'm a
Mhm.
huge fan of that book. I read the whole thesis from beginning to end. And now that book is very hard to find and expensive. And I think there's a
Yeah.
reason for that. I think he touches on something that most people are asleep at the wheel on, but you're obviously not. So can you speak a little bit more about the distinction that this bill is more than just owning Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, so if you're thinking about Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining through the lens of Jason Lowry's thesis, then something like Mind in America is a piece of policy that you might support more than other types of policy. And the reason why is because that thesis essentially outlines that we need to have a domestic mining, what he would call hash force. That's probably I don't quite see the mining sector being militarized quite yet, but there will certainly be, in my opinion, military applications, defensive military applications for cyber warfare that will be researched and maybe even attempted, or actually are being researched and maybe will be attempted. And so having your own set of Bitcoin mining, your own hash force here in the United States is going to become incredibly important. You don't want to be relying on your foreign adversaries, or really any adversary, or any foreign nation when it comes to something like Bitcoin mining. The same is true for holding the asset as well. There's all sorts of interesting military applications to the use of the Bitcoin network, which does require holding or owning Bitcoin to be able to transact over it. And I'm very much looking forward to when we can do work on projects and policy that result in positive outcomes, which really, I think, ultimately codify some of these ideas that Major Lowry has been working on for so many years. And of course, he was originally criticized, but now things seem to be moving the right direction, not only internal to the world that he's in, but also externally as we talk to more people on Capitol Hill.
That's interesting. My thought with this bill is it definitely other crypto bills have like focused on regulation, securities law, and like consumer protections. But what we're talking about here is more about industrial policy and dominating that new frontier. What I'm wondering is a lot of what we're talking about can apply to one of the more hyped up topics, AI. Do you foresee either this bill or future bills having any kind of ability to tie into like AI policy, since energy infrastructure and things like that can kind of apply to both? Or are you strictly kind of trying to be opposed to commingling those goals here?
No, absolutely. There's crossover policy that is in Mind in America today, and that we're working on and we're doing deep research on. The one area where this policy where Mind in America currently overlaps, is that when you are converting from Chinese-made hardware to U.S.-made hardware, you can choose to onboard digital asset, Bitcoin mining hardware, or you can choose to onboard artificial intelligence hardware, and you will still be accredited for that conversion. So there is a process by which, if you decide to pivot into AI, you will earn credit towards your conversion in that voluntary program at Commerce. So that way, and I'll outline it a little bit more. The basic premise is like, year one, to be able to qualify as a certified miner, you have to stop buying Chinese-made hardware. Year two, you have to cut your fleet down by 25%, meaning now you have 25% US-made hardware. It could be artificial intelligence, or it could be Bitcoin mining. Year three, it's 50%. And then year four, you're fully converted over to US-made mining hardware or artificial intelligence. But at the point at which you jump into the program at year one, you become certified. And in order to maintain that certification, you have to follow that conversion over time. And just to go back to the conversion credit, every Chinese-made hardware you remove is counted, but it needs to be replaced by digital asset mining hardware or artificial intelligence, or there are some. I believe there's a provision in the bill that allows for high performance compute, but again, it all has to be U.S. made hardware or allied hardware.
And kind of a follow up to that question: does it matter what cryptocurrency the hardware is mining, or what consensus mechanism it's using? So you mentioned earlier that Ethereum uses proof of stake. Essentially, it's not energy intensive. They don't have these huge miners that are, really ramping up and cost a lot of money and use a lot of energy. Does it matter? Is it pretty, crypto agnostic, or is it focused on proof of work in Bitcoin?
I mean, it's definitely focused on proof of work. You need to have some type of compute. So proof of stake wouldn't work at all. It doesn't, it's not a large load. It's not a large compute. So it would need to be Bitcoin mining, but it could also be any other type of proof of work. Generally speaking, and this is also one of the things that I've had to spend time. I spend a lot of time educating lawmakers, and sometimes I spend a lot of time educating Bitcoiners about how policy works. And one of the most persistent, consistent, regular approaches to policy, doesn't matter whether you're talking about solar, doesn't matter whether you're talking about Bitcoin mining, any type of technology, it's always written in a way where it's tech neutral. That gives it the highest chances of passing, because passing a law is already difficult. And then if you have to turn around and tell everyone why your specific technology should be the only one that gets access and everybody else should be excluded, becomes incredibly difficult as well. And there's not just because you have to tell them why you're picking winners and losers, but also because a lot of lawmakers know, because they've been through this process. And oftentimes what happens is if you write a bill that's incredibly technology specific, oftentimes they have to come back and revisit that bill and change it because technology changes rapidly over time. And so there is this culture, very strong culture within state legislatures and also in Washington, D.C., that if it's not tech neutral, like it's not going anywhere. Like we're not going to work on this together. Now there are occasional concepts and ideas and approaches that I think would make more sense. It's like we have a gold reserve. We don't have a gold, copper, all these other types of reserves in the same. Now we probably have metal reserves aside, but like the gold reserves, it's the reason why we have it is sort of singular. It's a monetary tool. So like something like a Bitcoin reserve, you could convince lawmakers like why Bitcoin should be the only thing in the Bitcoin reserve. But when you're talking about something like this mining policy, that's very difficult to work on tech exclusive policy. And so it's very tech neutral, but it's compute. So staking is not a compute driven type of consensus mechanism. So it would not be included in the legislation.
Thanks.
One of the things that you only briefly touched on, maybe kind of to wrap up some of the last points of the bill, is there's wording in here that really helps the strategic Bitcoin reserve become a reality. Could you talk a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, absolutely. So Satoshi Action has spent a lot of time working on strategic Bitcoin reserve legislation. We were the first organization to pass language into law in the state of New Hampshire. We worked on that Arizona bill that I mentioned to you before. And then Texas used a large portion of our model policy when they passed theirs into law, where they also appropriated $10 million. They've already used $5 million of the dollars to appropriate. And we've always had our eyes on the target of the federal government. Of course, the current administration decided to create an executive order to pause the auctions of digital assets broadly. They created the strategic Bitcoin reserve and the digital asset stockpile, but those are not codified into law. If there is not a law that passes, there is a risk that a future administration could come in and liquidate those positions, which I think is in my opinion, one of many reasons why the market is suffering right now. I think there is this concern that this legislation won't be codified, and thus people are thinking in the future and going, well, there's 200,000 Bitcoin that the US government currently holds that may or may not be entering the marketplace. So it's creating market risk. I don't think that's the driving force, but I think it certainly is playing a role in people's minds. So what this bill does, though, is it takes a very responsible, pragmatic, progressive approach. And when I say progressive, I just mean making incremental progress, not the progressive in the political sense. But what it does is it codifies the strategic Bitcoin reserve and it codifies the digital asset stockpile. And then it stops there and it says, okay, now that we have these things codified, what we want to do is we want to do the same exact approach that's in Arizona. We want to stake the assets that are in the digital asset stockpile, and we want to use the revenue from that to buy Bitcoin for the strategic Bitcoin reserve. Additionally, the legislation puts another tool in the toolbox of the Treasury, and it says if Treasury wants to go buy Bitcoin, when they may have this revenue, they're going to go buy Bitcoin with it. They may offer, they don't have to, but they may offer a capital gains exemption to whoever they're purchasing the Bitcoin from. This puts Treasury in a better negotiating position. It's a tool in their toolbox to negotiate a better approach to how they purchase the Bitcoin, price of the Bitcoin, the volume of the Bitcoin. It also expands the scope of how much Bitcoin they could buy, not only from a dollar perspective, but also because there are certain times when the liquidity of what's available in the marketplace could become relatively thin. So this is just a tool to say, hey, we have this, we're willing to pay you, X price. We can give you a cap gains exemption when we're doing that. So all of it is sort of this like giant virtuous loop. We'll start at the beginning, and I think there's an important part which I would like to include that I haven't mentioned yet. You have the Bitcoin miners. They're buying all the US made hardware, becoming certified. We're breaking that supply chain problem with China, solving the national security problem, creating jobs, and encouraging Bitcoin miners to do good things for the grid. Those certified miners have the ability to sell their Bitcoin into the strategic Bitcoin reserve and earn that cap gains exemption. But it's only the certified miners that can do it. So that's also creating another incentive, because if you move to US made hardware, you have this potential incentive of having your Bitcoin bought with a capital gains exemption. Our goal is to drive massive demand for US made hardware. There's really two policy levers that you can approach when it comes to industrial policy, as you mentioned before. You have supply side and you have demand side. This is really pushing very, very, very hard on demand, highly encouraging folks to buy more hardware because they get something in return for doing that good thing. On the supply side, it's like, let's offer a tax credit to the manufacturer so that they actually build the hardware. I'm open to those types of policies. They weren't included in this piece of legislation, but I wouldn't be surprised if in the future someone tries to attempt something like that. Because this is not just another type of compute. It's actually kind of up there with artificial intelligence when it comes to national security. And some in the military might say there are certain applications which are incredibly important for protecting our national security. So I do believe that in the future, there's a possibility that the US does engage in that type of behavior the same way that they have done for fabricating chips in the United States. They have a supply credit, they have a demand approach as well. And ultimately, I think that eventually lawmakers will see the reasons for why we should do the same for Bitcoin mining hardware.
Yeah, it kind of creates like a closed loop, which helps us to become more independent and dominant. And I appreciate you kind of putting a bow on it by describing it that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I wanted to just kind of follow up and ask you to kind of wrap up our conversation here. We have the Bitcoin conference coming up here in about 3 weeks, end of April. And I saw you were listed as a speaker there this year. And look, I got to ask, because last year I think David Bailey went on like a rant, like publicly banning you from conference events or whatnot, but you're now scheduled to speak. What would have changed his mind to bring you back?
Hey man, water under the bridge. I don't know. I'm not David Bailey's personal advisor, but I'm glad to see that I'm able to speak at the conference this year. From going from being banned to being able to speak is a rapid transition. But we're in the Bitcoin space. Things change quickly, and really looking forward to the panel. I'm going to be up there with some great folks that are in the policy space that really understand what's going on, and just looking forward to the conversation. I'm glad to be able to be a part of the conference this year.
Yeah, and we are too. The reason why I ask is because Jeff and I are heading to the Bitcoin conference again this year. Any chance we can grab a quick meetup with you so we can thank you in person for coming on the show?
Of course, anytime. I love to hang out with my fellow Bitcoiners. I'll be there. I'll be around. Come grab me off the panel or before or anytime. You guys have my your contact information, so we'll set something up.
Yeah. Hey, Dennis, you have a great attitude about being banned, because sometimes when you're banned, it actually means you're doing something right. I mean, take it from Jason Lowery. His book was banned for a while. I mean, people get censored all the time for speaking the truth and standing up for what's right. So maybe I'm glad to see it's water under the bridge, though, and you're going to be there.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Despite the past, I've always thought the conference puts on a great show and has really great content, and it brings everyone together. That's why I go every year. Banned or not, I go every year because so many great people show up and a lot of great opportunities happen in and also around the conference as well.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely look forward to going this year and meeting you. There's a few things I'm highly anticipating to be able to hear as far as talks and presentations. And ultimately, I want to thank you on behalf of Jeff and I for coming on the show. our viewers want to ask you, if you like this, go ahead and share and send some comments if you have any questions about this bill or anything specific to Arizona. Ultimately, this is a Bitcoin show, but we hope our viewers got some kind of better understanding on how capital policy and infrastructure kind of converge in our space like this. And I hope you guys enjoyed it. And just 2 quick points I wanted to end on. If you're watching this and you're going to the conference, shoot us a comment. Send us a DM on X. We have links to our socials and Dennis' socials and his company in the description. But let us know. We'd love to be able to meet up with you, whether you're coming from Arizona or really anywhere else. So definitely get in contact with us. But specifically, too, if you're in Tucson, check out our Tucson Bitcoin Meetup. In fact, this evening we got our social meetup. We have one a month of those, 3 meetings a month total. But this is our first one that we're having where we have a sponsor sponsoring our meetup. So come out and support them for supporting us. You can join our Facebook group, which is a link down below, or we have our public-facing meetup.com page. It'll have all the information on the location and times, but we hope to see you tonight if you're able to come out. Jeff, any closing comments?
No, not really. Thanks, Dennis, for your time today. This has been a great conversation and definitely looking forward to connecting with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Shaun, Jeff. Looking forward to seeing you at the conference.
Sounds good. Thanks again. And guys, if you don't have Bitcoin, we say get off of zero. And if you do have Bitcoin, keep stacking sats. We'll see you guys on our next regular episode on Monday. Have a good day, everyone.